We're in for a very exciting final part of the day today. We've had 4 great sessions so far, and I think we are trying to save definitely the best for the last. We've got 2 very, very exciting sessions coming up. I have the privilege of moderating the first one. Friends, the speaker we're going to invite on the dais is a man of great repute. Is a man who's achieved more than majority of us can dream about in our lives. Currently serving as the chairman of Oxfam India, a global NGO. This man's greatest achievement or greatest contribution to the country probably some would debate would be his contribution to the IT industry. The single biggest reason for putting NASSCOM in the position of power that it is, for putting Indian IT on the map, taking over as chairman of NASSCOM in 2001 after the sudden demise of its then founder, Mr. Mehta, and taking its stewardship up till 2008. Awarded the Padma Shri in 2007, the Forbes Face of the Year in 2003. The man who was called in to solve the huge Satya mess, as we all know and have heard about innumerable times. Business Week's Star of Asia in 2004. Also the person who set up the famous Discovery networks across South Asia in 1995. Ladies and gentlemen, the resume and the CV is longer than one can imagine. The list of accomplishments go on. And his only request to me initially was, please keep it to 2 or 3 sentences, my introduction. I said, that's something which is not possible. Friends, a very warm round of applause for Mr. Kiran Karnik. So I would request you to share with the audience for a few minutes, for 15, 20 minutes, your thoughts, and we can take it up for Q&As after.
Thank you for that generous introduction, and good afternoon. Delighted to see you all here and to come for this session. This seemed very exciting to me, and I was just sharing with some friends here that I was first wondering why I'm here, given that it's about young Indians. Then I remembered a friend of mine, a colleague and a contemporary, who is a member of something called the Young Professionals Organization. And he's a contemporary of mine. So I said, maybe if he can be a young professional, why can't I be with young Indians? But it's nice to be amongst younger people, because I think you will raise questions, and I hope you will, that some of us at my age hesitate to ask. It's the advantage of being idealistic, passionate, and driven, and of not being fearful, is to ask so-called stupid questions. Because as I want to address that in a few minutes, a lot of the great things in this world, particularly the things that are different, the things that are innovative, come from so-called stupid questions, saying, yeah, that's so, but why can't it be this way? To most people of my age, it would say, obviously it can't be, but to somebody like you, it will be, why not? And maybe you'll make it happen. I want to just spend a few minutes, in some sense, laying the floor of what I want to speak about, but I want to spend much more time on answering your questions and what's on top of mind for you, rather than going on and on about what I think you might want to hear. But I just want to start off to sort of warm you up, you might say, and I'm glad you had tea, because one of the dangers of an afternoon session is people are either falling off to sleep or wanting to go out. But I'm glad you're all back here, and I've had a cup of tea. I want to start with a little bit of warming up, and I want to talk of much of this through brief anecdotes. First, I want to talk about the change in the positioning of India, where we were and where we are, and talk a little bit of that through 1 or 2 anecdotes that are actually true. You may or may not believe it. The first one is a hackneyed one. Many of you may have heard it. But I relate this because it is truly and genuinely a personal experience. When I first started going abroad, and I won't tell you when that is. Okay, it's the 1970s, when probably none of you were born. When I used to go abroad at that time, and when you went to an airport, irrespective of which country you went to, but frankly, much more in the Western world, but even other countries, the first thing you do when you get off the plane is you go to the immigration desk and you put your passport there. And the guy looks at the passport, oh, India. And the person behind the desk, who's probably doing his job, but it's not a very high-level person, the look on his and sometimes her face and the body language says it all. It was a mixture of contempt, of some degree of concern. Is this guy trying to cheat me? Is there something wrong? Some degree of dislike. Indians, frankly, were not terribly popular. They were looked down on. They were not considered great. They were considered guys who, maybe an illegal immigrant, I better watch out. The whole outlook was very different. that went on. It didn't change very radically. It changed a little bit slowly over the years as people in other countries got a little more open about other countries, other citizens, other kinds of people, but didn't change radically. But come the 90s, and suddenly there was a change. From the mid-90s on, I noticed this actually personally, that you went abroad, and in this case, most of the Western capitals, you put that same passport in a very similar person's desk, and suddenly you'll be greeted with smiles. Ah, sir, you're from India. How are you? Welcome. And suddenly the whole body language, the kind of reaction would change. Indians suddenly became respected. They suddenly were looked on with favor. They were considered the good guys. And so, radical change. Now, I can attribute some of this somewhat, in a biased manner, you might say, to IT and what IT did to the image of the country outside. But there were other things also, frankly. Post-1991, the economic takeoff, the sudden perception of India as a high-growth place, a big market, yes, a poor country, but phenomenal, smart guys, and particularly in the US and UK, and to some extent in Europe, the perception was these Indians are knowledgeable, smart, clever, hardworking, and have good values. Everything positive. You can't imagine anything more values. So we were suddenly greeted very, very tremendously. This was one kind of change I saw over the years. The second one, which is an anecdote, which is again, believe it or not, true. This dates back to the dot-com era, but continues even today. And I must tell you, this is an anecdote with some change of names. The dot-com era was when everybody came up with bright ideas and went to some, angel investor or a VC and said, I need funds for this thing. And typically you would do what is called an elevator pitch, which is in 30 seconds. An elevator pitch, as you know, comes from the fact that you're traveling in an elevator from the first floor to the 10th floor, and you say what you want to in those 10 floors before the elevator reaches the 10th floor. And if it's interesting, then the VC says, come, let's talk. So in those days, there's the story of a young person with a bright idea who met this VC in the elevator, literally, and made a 30-second pitch. It seemed quite interesting. The guy said, hey, I'm intrigued by this a little bit. Come day after tomorrow, let's talk. Come to my office at 2:30. So our young man goes there, all prepared. Unlike many in the dot-com years who didn't have a business plan, who just thought that, getting eyes and making it sticky would work, he actually had a business plan. So he went there, said, give me 10 minutes for the presentation. He said, fine, you have your 10 minutes. He made a presentation. The VC was very impressed and went on talking to him, quizzed him more, found out everything, and said, hey, I'm very impressed with your business plan. So who's the team? Who's put this all together? He said, I'm the CEO. I've done an MBA from Harvard with a background in computers from Carnegie Mellon. He says, who else? He says, my CTO is a PhD from Stanford. He's worked many years in big companies. Now he wants to get to a startup. He has experience of 12 years. My CFO is a CPA who's had 10 years of experience in a variety of companies, including some startups, and he's found this exciting, so he's joining me. And the fourth member of our team is a person who's going to help us with the marketing. She's worked on consumer goods, knows the market, knows people, knows what is to be done, has had a great track record, a very high flyer in a big company, but fed up of big companies with their bureaucracy and so wants to join us. The guy says, fabulous. Your business plan is great. Your team seems fabulous. We're so well qualified. Looks very, very good. So how much do you need? He says, 10 million will see us to really take off and almost get us to an IPO stage. So the VC says, hey, not bad. I think you need a little more, and I'm willing to consider even giving you more than what you're asking for. But just one question, You told me all about your team and their background. Who are they? What are their names? So this guy says, the first guy is Jim, the second guy is Harry, and the woman on the team is Jane. The VC said, oh, sorry, I can't fund you. So this guy's shocked, yeah? He says, instead of 10 minutes, you give me 45 minutes. You said my business plan is great. You said my team's rightly qualified. Everything is right. So, sir, please tell me what's wrong. What have I done wrong? Why have you suddenly changed your mind? He says, look, yeah, you don't have a Srinivasan. You don't have a Ramanujan. You don't have anybody from India and you want me to fund you. No hope. Now, this is repeated in many different ways, but frankly, this is true. The image of India and the Silicon Valley was that these guys are not only smart and clever, they're very good entrepreneurs. And if you want to build a successful entrepreneurial team, you must have at least one Indian in the team to make it and drive it. And this is, again, true. And again, this is such a change from earlier days where Indians were considered, even though they're bright and good, they were considered guys who would come and work in a company or work in a university, not entrepreneurs. Indians were never known as entrepreneurs in the outside world, except limited parts and in very limited ways. The story, of course, of motels or of people in East Africa, very limited to that, but certainly not in the tech space. And suddenly things changed. And even today, genuinely, if you have Indians on your team and you go to a VC funder or an angel funder in the Silicon Valley, you got straight away a high probability of getting funds from them. I think these are the kinds of changes you've seen as you've gone on. The final comment I want to make is in terms of why this has happened. You know, when I was growing up and very, very young in school and then in college, I could sense, looking back, no, I didn't think of it at that time, the country had just got out of colonialism for a few years, and we were finding our nationhood, you might say. People in the world, rest of the world, were saying, is India going to survive? Is it going to break up? What will happen? And some of you who have read past history would know there were questions like, after Nehru, who? And somebody said, after Nehru, what? Because Nehru, they felt, had held the country together, and this country might break up. That was a sort of perception all the time in those years. And because of that, we had a sort of mentality, what I would call a siege mentality. The world is out to get up, we got to get us, we got to protect ourselves. Part of this, therefore, was in the way we drove our policies, what we did. A lot of it is reflected in the economic policy, which built barriers. Just as you build defense barriers, we built a defense economically. It's very high tariff barriers, saying, hey, we don't want all these outside goods to come and flood us, so we're going to build barriers. So you had import duties of things like 150% on software import. And one of the first things that the IT Association did, which was very contrary to what most industry associations at that time were doing, I would say not even most, I'd probably say all, which kept asking for higher import duties so that domestic production would be protected. Because they say import come in, we can't compete, so we need protection. So you had high duties. And the IT industry was the first to go and tell the government, reduce the software duty to 0. And the government frankly thought we are mad, you know. These guys, I mean, you want to build a software industry in India, you're talking of IT as being India's future, and you're telling us to allow imports at 0 duty when we have them at 150%. What's wrong? And the stance we took was, no, we will and can compete because this is an industry that's global. And incidentally, all industries are going to get global. And so you just cannot survive unless you're able to compete. Your companies here will not do well just on the domestic market. We need an external market. And we need to build an external market on robust economic foundations, which means that we can't afford these tariff barriers. And the government at that time, possibly with great foresight, possibly thinking, you know, how much is the software import? You know, it's a few $1 million. These guys are mad, but let's do it. Let's see what happens. They actually dropped the duty. And in a few years, you found the IT industry taking off. Partly because the IT industry at that time realized two things. One, that if you got in foreign software products, they would need to be serviced. We would understand them. We would first provide service in India to support them, to provide all the backup to them, do everything else that's required. And that experience will then enable us to do the same thing outside the country. So we became largely a services industry. And that's how the IT industry, as many of you know, evolved. And which is one reason why even now people ask, but why aren't there products from India? When are we going to create a Windows in India? We will one day, I can assure you. You will, not we will. You will do that. But the start, and that's why I mentioned this little bit of history, was from the point of view of saying we will service this. And it's worked wonderfully. As you know, our big companies, which do some good work in creating intellectual property and producing some small custom-made products, in doing B2B software, but their bread and butter continues to be service. You look at the large Indian companies, their main thing is service, and they've grown. And they've grown to challenge the multinationals on their own turf, not in India, but in their own turf. So there are Indian companies competing with the large service providers, you might say the IBMs of the world, in the US or in Europe or in Australia, all over the world. And it's been a very successful model. And I think this is another kind of repositioning that's happened. And one of the reasons this happened, I mentioned a little bit of history. I want to go back to finally one more bit of history. You know, in the early years, India was looked at, if at all countries outside imported any Indian goods, it was looked at as a source of cheap products. And cheap in the worst sense of the term. Cheap meant not only low cost, but low quality, unreliable. That was the sort of image that Indian products had. When the IT industry came on and we realized that we've got to be global, we've got to get on the world, we realized that there's historical baggage which we have to contend with. There's no point pretending it doesn't exist. The fact is, anything from India is looked at with suspicion and doubt. It's just like my going abroad in the 70s and being looked at with suspicion, doubt, and dislike. And we had the same story. And the way to overcome that, we realized, was to set quality standards that were recognized globally. And so the Indian IT companies took it as a challenge on themselves to say, we will meet the best quality standards as laid down by global standards institutions. There's a global standard called CMM. Those of you from the IT business would know that. and highest level of standard, level 5, was what we aspired for. In a short span of 4 or 5 years, with a huge thrust, which we pushed from NASSCOM and the IT industry worked on it, in a few years, we had more of the highest certified quality companies in the world than the rest of the world together. So there were more highest level certifications in India than all the other countries put together, including the big Western countries. Interestingly, even the multinationals, their operations here were at a higher level of quality certification than their home operations in the US or Europe or UK. I think that established the quality. And I can tell you something else. Some of you are in business, you might know it, that has had a positive rub-off or spin-off for other industries. Because now my friends from other industries tell me, hey, we no longer have to contend with this mindset that something from India must be poor quality. In fact, it's the reverse now. They assume that if it's from India, then the quality and reliability must be good. Unless they find something wrong, they find that it's workable. So I think this is something else where the country and industry has been able to reposition itself. That's where we are today. And this is built on a lot of hard work, a lot of change, and a lot of things which have happened in a number of industries. I picked examples from IT by choice because that's where I spent many years. But in other industries, we have seen this, and I don't have to mention them all to you. Auto components, auto parts, designing, till recently pharmaceuticals. We're having some problems now, but those are, I think, temporary. We've been able to do a great deal and put ourselves there. But what of the future? This is where we are. And if we rest on this, we are not going to get too far. Because competition is beginning to catch up. I can tell you in the IT industry, our magic formula has been quicker, better, cheaper. Quicker because we work harder, and of course we're able to put more people on the job. Better, I mentioned to you the quality standards that we have achieved, so we've been able to do that. And of course cheaper, because India is yet, compared to many of the countries we do business with, lower cost. But these are things which others can emulate. And they will. They're trying hard. China, Philippines, Vietnam, every country is looking at the India model and saying, hey, we want to be in IT what India is. And they're beginning to see how to get there, how to improve their quality, how can they make better deliveries, how can they do it quicker. Some of them have a low cost base that helps them as much as us, sometimes lower. So it's a challenge. So looking ahead, and not just the IT industry again, but across the board, what do we need to do? I think the future is not just cheaper, better, and quicker. Hopefully we retain that advantage, but is a critical fourth leg to that magic formula, and that is different. Today, everybody is looking for a product that can be differentiated. It's the old story of, cigarettes or soap. One's like the other. So you have to differentiate. So you pretend it's different, and you build the differentiation to building a brand, to putting in some ingredient, to changing the color, somehow making it look different. But in the technology world, which is the world of the future, different means innovation. You've got to innovate. You've got to do something that's completely new and different. Something that will save the end customer money, will save him or her time, or provide better service. There has to be some USP that is innovative and that changes it from other products. Otherwise, products tend to get commoditized very fast. And once you're commoditized, you end up competing on things where you can't have a sustainable advantage. It will keep shifting. And many of the industries we talk of today are very footloose. They can be here today, and they'll be somewhere else tomorrow. We have seen this, for example, in electronics manufacturing. Started off in countries like Japan. Japan became very expensive. They moved to Taiwan. Taiwan got expensive and not sustainable. They moved to China. Now, many of them have moved from China to other countries like Vietnam and continuing to move. So this keeps moving. And the only way you can retain your advantage is if you can continuously innovate. And if you look for an example of that, look not at manufacturing, but look at other industries which are knowledge-based, and then look at the US. The US has continued to maintain a huge advantage in key industries where it continues to get the highest value. Take Apple. If you take any Apple product, if you look at their bill of materials, you might say, you'll find that 80 to 90% is produced outside the US. Everything from the casing to the electronics to the, every bit and piece that's there, to the screen that is there, everything. So what have they done? Where does the value go? Those guys get 2%, 3%, 4% margins. The margin is captured by Apple because of its design, because of its marketing. And the design is innovative. Every time competition tries to come up with something, they've innovated and done something new. And that's kept them in the lead all the time. New models, new products, continuous innovation. And thereby, they're able to capture value. And you can see this across the board in a whole host of industries, where the US, as a great innovator, has been successful. Even as manufacturing has moved outside, they've lost cost advantage. They continue to be hugely advantaged in areas like this. So I think the future is really about innovation. And that's something which, it has to be done by small companies, young people, and young companies, because companies that are large and bureaucratic find it very difficult to innovate. People who are old and have too much experience, people like me, tend to tell you, as I started with intentionally, all the reasons why something can't be done. It has to be somebody who's willing to ask the basic question, saying, why not this? It has to be somebody who says, a washing machine is fine, but why can't I use it to make lassi? And all of you know that story, I don't want to repeat it. Or somebody who looks at saying, how do I use a pen in outer space? If it's low gravity, the ink leaks. If it's a ballpoint pen, it won't write without gravity flow. What do? You devise, spend a lot of money and make a new pen, which is great technology, or you use a pencil. That is the kind of innovation that can only come when you think very differently. And I think you see example of that. We are great innovators. We are great innovators because we are a diverse country. So we're used to the concept of people thinking differently. There is no group think. We all think differently. In its worst form, it's visible on the roads, more so in Delhi than anywhere else. You've got a traffic jam here. Then if you're riding a two-wheeler or a motorbike, you go on the footpath, the pavement, and drive there. If you're driving a car, then the right side of the road is vacant, so why not use the right side of the road? So you go on the right side and drive along. We tend to like to break rules, not by intention, but because you're all the time thinking differently and thinking about how do I get ahead. Now that's bad. It's indiscipline, it's chaotic. But look at the positive side. How can you channelize this thinking differently, this wanting to get ahead, this wanting to be different? How can you channelize that to something useful organizationally? How can you create something out of that which is very different? And I think that's the crux of innovation, that how do you think differently and how do you channelize that different thinking into something that's productive, useful, and has value? And that's, I think, a challenge for all of you as you move ahead and go and push this hard. Two sort of mundane examples of this, which are very, very, they're not exciting innovations, but I just want to tell you because they're from personal experience. When I started off with Discovery Channel in India, in those days, some of you would know, this is the 90s, many of you may be too young to know that, the whole system was controlled by cable operators. The only off-air channels which you didn't have any satellite broadcasting were just starting at that time. The satellite broadcasts were received by the cable operator and sent to you on cable. So cable operator controlled everything. And because of the limitations of analog cable, they would distribute 8, 10 channels on so-called prime band and a few more channels which could only be received on sophisticated sets. So we brought in Discovery Channel. We had to talk to the cable operators. And every cable operator told us, this is great programming, But, all of us, I guess, have this self-perception. See, I like it, But this public को सिर्फ नाच गाना चाहिए. Public is somebody else. They're down there. I'm superior. I like it, but they won't like it, so I won't carry it. We had this great difficulty till we did two things. One is we repositioned the channel. Elsewhere in the world, the channel was known as a documentary channel, which was great and had great viewership at the upper end of the spectrum, but had great viewership around the world, in Europe, in the US, Australia. In India, I realized this won't work. And a few of you in the audience who are older would recall that if you went to a cinema theater and the minute you saw the films division documentary starting out, the whole hall would empty out. People would go out and have popcorn, have a smoke, chat with friends. Documentary was a bad one in India. It meant dull, boring, didactic. So we had to change that image. So the first thing we did was stop calling it documentary, and we said real life entertainment. So the cable operators then began to say, entertainment, something there. So it's good. The second one was, we're wondering how else to sell this to them. And saying you carry it, and you may not be able to get viewership, but it's something people want. Then I thought of the analogy which I think hit home very hard and very successfully, even more than the real life entertainment part. This was to ask every cable operator, in your house, kya dictionary hai aapke ghar mein? You have a dictionary at home? He said, of course. How often do you read it? How often do you refer to it? He said, rarely, I said, you have a dictionary? He says, yes. So I told him, Discovery Channel is like a dictionary. Every home will want it. It may not have large viewership. It won't be watched like Zee or Star Plus or whatever. You won't watch all the soaps on it. But every home will want it. So you're okay because your subscribers will want it. And they said, yeah, I could see the eyes light up. He said, that is right. That's one example of, just positioning, just I talk of countries repositioning, in a slightly innovative way. The other example I want to give you is real life, and I can share it now. I don't want to talk too much of it for other reasons, but I want to talk a little bit about Satyam, which you mentioned. And, we won't go into the whole story. It was a huge fraud, done very cleverly in an innovative way, which I don't want to address now because some of you may be tempted to emulate it. But, we managed to stabilize the company and get it going reasonably well. Having got it to that stage in about a month and a half or 2 months, we were clear from the beginning, the board, that the company needed a new owner who would bring in money, take it over and run it. And everybody had agreed initially, we have to do something as long as we protect the employment, so 50,000 people don't go out of a job, and the company continues, and the reputation of the country, saying we did turn around a company that was sinking, unlike Enron and so on, would be good. So about a month and a half or 2 months down the line, everybody began to see that this was getting successful. Company had stabilized, people stayed, customers stayed, we were beginning to get money coming in from customers. And suddenly in the government, people started taking the view, but why do you want a new buyer? Why do you want to sell the company? Let's run it. You continue as you are. And this was something we knew wouldn't work because we were sort of on oxygen. We were managing the company, but we needed a new owner. So we met, let me mention the name, the de facto acting PM at that time, which is Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, our present president, because some of you would recall in those days, our Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, was going through a heart bypass, so he was in hospital. So we met him and told him where we were and told him, look, we have to find a new owner. In fact, we have to sell the company, bring in money if somebody has to run it. And he said, no, but all my advisors, the bureaucrats, the ministers, they say, it's running, we should keep it, we shouldn't sell it yet, we should wait, we don't know what the price will be, let's run it, you people are doing a great job, just stay on, what's the hurry? And some of my colleagues tried to explain to him the reasons why, and technology, and customers, and I could see we were losing him, he was not quite... I just thought of the simplest analogy, which is a crude analogy, but I told him, I said, Minister, let me tell you what it's like. If you have vegetables to sell, today they have a certain value. Tomorrow, they yet have good value. But day after tomorrow, you have to pay somebody to take them away. We are in that stage. He said, I say. So I could see his eyes again light up, This analogy of saying that this is a commodity which is decreasing value. Today it seems to have value, but if you keep holding on, it will sink and you won't get a buyer. You have to take it away. I think that hit home. And suddenly he says yes. Then our other reasons kicked in and we told him everything and got it. So again, just a question of how you put something. And again, I refer to it as not a great innovation, but as something which you need to think of at how do you make people not only think differently yourself, but how do you encourage others to think of things in a different light. And I think that's an important part of innovation, to be different yourself, but also how do you encourage others to be able to think differently and do something which you think is good. I think I should stop there. I've gone on for rather longer than what I anticipated. Lots of other stories, lots of things on innovation. But let's have questions, and I'm happy to elaborate a little bit on any of the things that you want to hear about, preferably on issues related to innovation, but anything else that you want. I'm happy to answer any question to the extent I can.
Thank you, sir. So I take the opportunity of asking the first question. So how much do you think is the education system of the country responsible for a sort of lack of innovation that we at least talk about, that we're not innovative people in terms of technology innovation, not so much in terms of getting your way through. So do you see a fundamental problem with education in the country?
I think you asked a very appropriate and crucial question. Many of us, me included, feel that our traditional education system is very constricting. It tends to very much train you into picking up information, a lot of information, memorizing it, and regurgitating it, which is what our exam system is about. I recognize that there have been changes. There are lots of schools that are doing things differently, and at the higher education levels also things have changed. But the traditional system which does this is yet an overwhelming majority. And if at all you see innovation yet there, my view is that it is despite this and not because of it. The second part, if I might add, taking the excuse of your question about what troubles me about how we need to promote innovation in the country and what are the barriers, this is one, the education system, and it's a major, major one. The second one, which I have deep concern about, and I'm glad to see it's changing radically, thanks to you people who are here, you've changed it. Not only in my growing up years, till about 10, 15 years ago, and to some extent in yet many parts, we are a very feudal society. You get almost trained in this from the beginning, that you obey your parents, which is a good thing. I hope people here do that. You obey your elder brother or sister. In school, you obey your teacher and you keep your mouth shut. You keep your ears and eyes open, hopefully. You get so trained in this feudalism, which I call, the feudal mindset, that you are unable to think for yourself, or if you think for yourself, you're not willing to disagree with your boss. The great thing about innovative countries and innovative systems is that, as I said earlier, you question everything. So-called stupid questions, if you like, but you question things. Now, when you're in a feudal mindset, you don't question. You're told what to do. Either you have a superior who tells you what to do, or you do the same to your juniors or your peers. You give them orders. And I think that mindset simplifies it. And if I were to put it in a sentence, and I'm glad that Mr. Kejriwal has taken up this, I said the Lal Batti on the car is a stop sign for science. Because science is about questioning. It's not about power. It's not about power equations. Anybody can question, saying, hey, I don't agree with Einstein's theory. And everybody will say, why? And if you can get enough data, enough proof, that's it. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter who's more powerful, doesn't matter how many Nobel Prizes something has won. As you know, science has evolved, it has changed. And some of the things that I learned up in school are no longer true today. So it has evolved because of questioning, because of the thing of rationality, of data, of evidence being crucial. And unfortunately, in much of our system, which tends to be feudal, we don't do it. I have seen a radical change which enthuses me a great deal, is the questions that come now. And I'm very happy to see that even in organizations today, the peer level interaction is extremely positive and high, and that the boss, administratively is the boss, but it's no longer the boss. You go and talk to him or her quite comfortably. You're on a one-to-one basis, and I think that encourages thinking which is not dictated by somebody else or the organization or the big boss. And I think that's important. But the school system, you're right. Even there, as I said, the majority of it is yet very constrained. But I'm glad that many, many schools have moved towards a more open system, towards encouraging projects, encouraging group and teamwork, not just individual ones. Even exams are changing. But a large part is yet very restrictive of innovation.
Great. Thank you, sir.
It's just,
Please.
Just an extent. Okay.
Sorry, just 1 sec. Please, ma'am.
So more than a question, this is about a ground reality. You talk of innovations, you talk of asking questions. Whenever I've tried to do that with the system or with my federation, or right now I'm talking about the sports because I represent that world, I've often been called a troublemaker, a rebel. Nobody's really appreciated my innovative questions and suggestions. Recently, I had an experience. I've been rooting for a physically challenged sports disability center dedicated to, especially for the people with physical disabilities, created that way. And after 3 years of continuous perseverance, 20 crores budget has been given on loan by Disability Affairs Ministry to Sports Ministry. In addition, they have asked for land and stuff like that. And so this matchmaking is going on. I'm a member of the panel. And when I refer to my federation and ask my seniors, sir, they are asking for a project report on nitty-gritties that are required to create the disabilities. I can pursue a dream, but I don't have the knowledge of project report. So can you get that for me? And they tell me that, are you an athlete or an official? So I request you to kindly start holding talks with the leaders of at least sports federations so that they get used to this idea of people asking them questions and giving them innovative ideas.
No, thank you very much for that comment. And I completely concur with you. As I said earlier, innovation is basically something different. Anything that's different threatens the system. All those who are in the system will always resist it, always, any innovation. So it's always a battle. And unless you have passion and persistence, you will not innovate. I mean, even innovative thinking, and think of Galileo and what he went through, and think of what you've gone through, and you're halfway there, but not fully.
Today is the last date for Commonwealth Games accreditation, where the long list of athletes had to reach IOA. And due to lack of information, we were told the story for CWG is over. But I'm glad I'm innovative, and I'm grateful that I ask questions. Today, 4 entries have gone from para sports because I asked questions took out the rule book and presented it to the officials, and they had to give way, and 4 deserving entries have gone today, sir. So I think
fabulous.
that makes a difference.
That's fabulous. And I think in
it
many
is
ways...
It is the cutoff date today, sir.
No, in many ways you...
So we've kind of saved 4, the innovation and the ability to ask questions has saved 4 sports careers today.
That's it. You've given the answer to your own question, that persistence and ability to do it, yes. But you won't always succeed. I should warn you, you've succeeded at least to a limited extent. You will fail. Innovators always have a problem. Sometimes the innovation fails, and you need to recognize that. But sometimes it doesn't go through, you have a problem. And you have to fight and fight. It's not easy. You need persistence, you need patience, you need commitment.
Thank you, sir. So my question is just an extension of what Shaurya initiated. Right from your education to feudal society to restrictions on open minds and innovations, to the statutory system which doesn't encourage you to be to have out-of-the-box thinking, and the financial system which doesn't support innovation. Now, with this kind of a background, it's no wonder that you have innovators from India succeeding in societies which are much more open-minded and welcoming to these elements. Then and thereby you have migration from India going abroad because of the system doesn't support innovation. And in fact, I had the good fortune of sitting with Deepa and reading through that mail, and I had a very engaging conversation with her, and I'm going to ask a few questions tomorrow when she's going to address the gathering.
Very good. No, I told you, I'd say it's a tough battle, but I think many people are coming back to that's good news. Second, I think we have to fight the system. And again, I would say we with some hesitation, I would rather say you. I'm at the stage where I'm very impatient, but don't have enough force or time to do it. You guys have got to do it. But in all these sort of somewhat, I would say, negative things, let me add a positive one, not an answer to your question, but more generally, and share this with you. A group of youngsters suddenly saw about 2 or 3 years ago an announcement of the Google X Prize for a lunar lander. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is to land a robotic spacecraft on the moon, move it for 500 meters, and show proof that you moved it. The big prize waiting there, $20 million, has to be a private effort, not a governmental effort. And these young guys, in that time they were much younger, this was about 4 years ago, they saw this and they saw there's not a single entry from India, and the deadline, something like what Chiu's mentioned, was 3 days away. So they just decided to bung in an entry and said, we'll see what to do. And they came to me just before that to tell me, look, we are very disappointed there's nobody from India. We want to put in something. We feel there must be an Indian effort. We don't know who will do it, but we want to make sure there's an entry and we'll try and get something together. I encouraged them and said, put it together. Today, those guys have taken off to the level where out of some 80 entries around the world which were there, they're in the final 3. It's yet a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge because they've got to build a space-worthy lander. They've got to get a launch vehicle. They've got to get it near the moon. Then they've got to land it on the moon, make a soft landing. Then they've got to move, and they've got to get images of that. It's not going to be easy. But they're in the top 3. And this is a young group of, starting with 3 of them who just felt passionate saying, hey, why not from India? We should do it. And now they're working on it, and I don't know if they'll get there, but they've been able to rope in a lot of partners because of their passion, persistence, and commitment. They've got L&T on board already to do all the engineering work. They're in talks with ISRO to get a launch. They can't get a free launch, by the way, because one condition is 90% of the funding has to be private. So they have to pay for it. They're trying to raise money from around the world, not just India, as an India effort. And they're going ahead, they're moving on. So good news of it. Some of it is innovative, some of it is not. It's just pushing the technological fringe. But some good news of stuff like that, which is being done by young people. So the system is tough, but you got to keep fighting it.
We succeed despite the system, not without.
Absolutely, I completely agree. The system tries to constrain you, and you got to keep doing 2 things. One is succeed despite the system, and second, either the same people or some other people have got to see how to change the system to make it a little more innovation friendly. Both efforts have to go on.
Great. Thank you, sir. Aditi, you had your hand up. Mike, please.
Actually, sir, just listening to you very intently, just one small question, that most of our research and development happens only in the premier institutions. I mean, there are very many students who are very creative but never get an opportunity because the big firms only hire from the IITs and the IIMs. They're very selective. So, I mean, what is your take on that? I mean, if we, in fact, have a fantastic program in VII where we go and take road to ideas and we look for innovations in the rural sector and other places. We are trying to bring it out. But is there a way that we can scale it up? If you can give us some suggestions that, we can give credit to people who are there, but not in the premier institutes. and funding for such students or probably such innovators?
Absolutely. No, the two responses to your question. And you're right, this is a big issue because of this mindset saying much of the funding goes to the IITs or maybe the IIMs, and the sense that brighter students, in quotes, are at these places. And I don't think it's really true, because academically being bright is not enough. But two things which I'm very happy with. One is, I don't know if you're familiar with the National Innovation Foundation and what they do. They do a lot of work at grassroots innovation, trying to go around the country. They do these things which Professor Anil Gupta from IIM Ahmedabad does, called Shodh Yatras. They walk around the country. It's actually a walking thing. They go to different villages, try to look at what is innovative at the grassroots level, maybe a simple innovation, and they pick some of those innovations. They do a large countrywide contest, and that then includes colleges across the board. At the moment, they're restricted to engineering colleges, but engineering colleges of all types, not just the top level ones. And they select through long screening process, and they do an exhibition every year. I think it's on even till tomorrow at Rashtrapati Bhavan. They've been able to persuade the president, starting from President Kalam, who used to be a great enthusiast, that he should host this. So they get the top 100 innovations and show them at Rashtrapati Bhavan, and the top ones are awarded by the president. And these are grassroots innovators from across the country, and I'm very happy this is happening. We need much more of that, but this is happening. About 4 months back in Pune, I don't know if any of you are from Pune, they did a large one, starting with a company which initiated it, and then tying up with a university in Maharashtra. And they did a large exhibition, which had, I think, 300 different innovations of all types, all kinds, from agricultural to use in cities and all kinds of things. Some were very simple, but some were good. But I think the climate is building up for finding innovation and innovators. Second response is something interesting which we've tried to do, and partly in answer to the question you asked about IITs and IIMs. One of the efforts we've initiated from the National Innovation Council, and I've been very keen on that, is to give, that National Talent Search scholarships, which try to find the highest talent. And typically, because of lack of any other thing, the talent is defined as academically bright. And we said we want an innovation scholarship that is not looking at those who are academically bright, but looking at those who have innovated in some way, as you said earlier, despite the system, you might say, starting from 9th grade onwards, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. We're just initiating this scholarship now, which will be a large countrywide scholarship, a few thousand scholarships for people for 4 years. If they've got something interesting right from 9th grade, we will support them and provide them a scholarship for 4 years to take that innovation forward, or to just promote their innovative thinking in different ways. So the idea is to not go only by academic excellence, which will probably get them into an IIT or later an IIM, but to go by people who think differently, who may not be that innovative, who may not be that academically bright, in the sense they are not interested in doing academics. And we know from the rest of the world that many of the great innovators of creative things are often college dropouts, because they were not interested in the academic part. They're bright, sharp, but they're not interested necessarily in academics. And I think the idea is to try and identify such people and encourage and promote them.
Great.
Hello, sir.
Guru.
I have this. So I come from the Lucknow chapter of Young Indians. So as a state, UP, they export or they manufacture 100,000 engineers every year, which form a large part of the workforce, and they serve in Bangalore or in the Hyderabad. Why can't UP, as in with an IIT, an IIM, and a triple IT, why can't they become a powerhouse of another of IT? Why not Lucknow as in be seen as the next investment city after Bangalore or Hyderabad? What steps can we take to make it as a city of IT?
To make that happen, you've got to be part of a larger ecosystem which has to be positive and helpful. And there are a number of factors that either promote or deter investments, and providing a hub so that people don't go away but things happen there. Simple things starting from law and order matter. Is the place safe? Is it comfortable? Do people willing to be there? Second, what is the support system? Third, things like power. Now, some places do well despite all these constraints because of just the availability of talent, but some they become constraints. And I can give you 2 examples from what I was very keen on and tried to push, and with reasonable success from my days in NASSCOM. 2 places specifically, many others, but 2 of them. One was Calcutta. Everyone in the IT industry, when, for completely vested interest reasons, I'm particularly fond of Calcutta. I spent some part of my youth there and have very fond memories. So I was very keen on Calcutta. But that apart, I thought it's a city which has a lot of talent in itself, but in Bengal and the Northeast, which needs to be a hub. So we tried very hard to promote it, and we worked with the government to tell them what is required to make Calcutta an IT hub. And we were successful in getting not all, but many of the things done. And so those of you in Calcutta would recognize that while it's not ideal, at least the new developments at Rajarhat and even in Salt Lake show some promise of coming. And we were able to establish that by just doing what you said as a starting point, saying, look, here are the figures of the talent that exists in that area, the talent pool you can tap, just like the 100,000 you mentioned. We showed there are figures. Then I was able to persuade companies that, look, of the talent you're actually hiring, not just availability, the talent you're hiring, a fair percentage are in fact from Calcutta. And they would love to go back there if they had the opportunity. So instead of getting them from there to here, why don't you go and set up there? So it will begin to happen. The second one was in Trivandrum and Kochi, where again, slower but much success. And some of you may be familiar, but if not, do look it up on the net or wherever, something called Smart Village in Kochi, which is again a very interesting initiative which the state government has supported, but which is an initiative of young entrepreneurs. These are entrepreneurs who started when they were in college, very successful. I met them when they were in college and just said some encouraging words, not knowing what they'd end up with. The guy built up a huge 100 crore business in a few years and then said, hey, I want to pay back, not in some generally socially good sense, but I want to pay back in the sense that all the things that encouraged me to be an entrepreneur and all the bottlenecks that I had, I want to understand those and take care of those for other entrepreneurs. So he set up this thing called Smart Village in Kochi. State government has provided good support and now it's taken off. There are, some 50 or 60 startups there. 2 of them raised huge amounts of money from funders outside the country now as part of success. And they're doing well. So an ecosystem can be created, but it requires commitment from the people and a lot of support from the state. Because at the end of the day, the totality of the ecosystem does depend on state support. If the state doesn't support it, or is not so keen, or is not well governed, it becomes difficult. I wouldn't say it's impossible, it becomes difficult. Which is why states like UP, Bihar, they don't have a hub. UP excluding Noida. Noida is NCR really, not really in that sense. But it can happen one day. And around Lucknow, for example, there's no reason why it shouldn't happen. With an IIT and an IIM, a lot of good talent there, engineering colleges, a huge catchment area of bright people. One day it will happen, but it requires a lot of good ecosystem. And remember, you're in a competitive environment. Just as globally India is competing, each of these states and cities are competing with others for investments and companies coming in. Unless you're proactive, as at one time chief ministers in Andhra and Karnataka were, which attracted a lot of investment, new investment into completely new hubs like Hyderabad. Unless you do that, it won't work.
Sir, I have a question. Actually, most of the Western countries go through a phase where, primarily they are an agrarian economy, they become an industrial economy, and then they become a service economy when they are well developed. But now we see India going straight from being an agrarian economy into a service economy. So it invites a question whether it is good for the country. And the reason I ask is that even though IT is a driver of the economy right now, hardly about 1 million to 2 million people of our population are engaged in the IT industry. And unlike the manufacturing industry, the IT industry does not have the trickle-down effect to the economy. So, what are your thoughts on this? Is this the way forward? So, on a policy level, is this?
Okay, just a brief response. I'll summarize. But first, on the IT industry, let me correct the notion because I want to try and make sure you get the right thing across. You're right that in proportion to India, the employment is limited, but it's 3 million people employed directly and about 10 million people employed indirectly. There's a trickle-down effect, which is large, for maintenance of the large real estate that these companies need, drivers, cafeteria, security, and the rest of this support system, which is the 6 or 7 million of indirect employment, is typically 12th class or less. So it's not as if only elite employment of engineers or highly qualified people. A large part of the employment is in fact in the lower. But your basic question, many people feel that we need manufacturing because manufacturing creates jobs and we need jobs in this country. Now, India is a large country and we can't not have a manufacturing base. We need to be manufacturing. But in my view, this sense that manufacturing is going to be a big job driver is somewhat misplaced because as you begin to look even today, manufacturing is getting more and more automated around the world. Not because labor is expensive, but because of quality, repetitivity, reliability. And who do you put out of jobs first? The first jobs are lost by those at the bottom of the pyramid. So if you're looking at large-scale employment from manufacturing, for those who are moving from agriculture, it's going to be a difficult battle. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying it's not that simple. In fact, services in general, not just IT, provides more employment and provides more employment down the whole chain. I mean, take a thing like tourism. tourism requires hotels. Hotels require tremendous amount of support staff, many of whom are semi-skilled, unskilled people. Construction. So you get a lot of these kinds of things which can create jobs. Finally, just a brief thing to your point, and this is a point of some discussion, and it's worth debate, at least in your own minds. Can you move from agriculture straight to sort of skip over the intermediate stage? Now, not to say you won't do manufacturing, but the manufacturing we may want to do is high-level manufacturing. We say IT-based manufacturing, so based on designs, based on, as I said, intellectual property, based on leveraging IT rather than doing routine, low-end manufacturing. Maybe there's a future there if we can combine our skills in IT software with manufacturing.
One last question from Shankar.
Good evening. My name is Shankar from Coimbatore. I was reading your profile, trying to understand from 1947 what's been happening. Truly inspiring, and the career itself is absolutely full of innovation. How did this happen? How so many diverse interests, diverse opportunities, and I just want to know how your life was built like that. It's absolutely interesting.
One thing I'm always reluctant to do is talk about myself. I think it's just lucky I was in the right place at the right time. But I must say, I say this not to talk of myself, but for some of you to reflect on satellite broadcasting to just broadcasting, which was TV, at a time when TV revolution began to happen in India in the 90s, with cable and satellite and everything else. And I guess I was lucky to do IT in the years when I did, when we were, thinking that the Indian IT story is over with the end of Y2K and .com, the .com bust. And that was 2001 was when it was all over when I took over. But we saw some great years, and we saw tremendous increase in exports and so on. So just being there, so not really choosing. But the one lesson I can tell you, which I have learned for myself, not that I practice, is that, do what you enjoy and commit yourself to it. And if you do what you enjoy, you will excel. And it doesn't matter to you what you are. You're a sportsman, a chef, a high-level professional, an innovator, a technological creator. If you excel, you'll make both name and fame, and make money incidentally if you want to. But I think it doesn't matter where you are. But you must excel. And you won't excel unless you enjoy what you're doing. So if you're not enjoying what you're doing, you better question yourself. Is this something I want to do in life? If you enjoy it, you will do well. And if you do well and you push yourself, you will excel. And that's the secret of what you can say. Well, that's it. Hey, thank you. I've way overrun my time. My apologies.
So ISRO, IT, telecom, broadcasting, innovation, I think you've done it all. But I think as a takeaway, finally, your last words, passion and excellence. If that's something we can all take from you, I think we will all be in different places personally in our own lives and hopefully take this country forward as well. Thank you, sir. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. The country as diverse as India and one of the youngest growing countries in the world, I think we have a responsibility to target the youth and give them direction. With that in mind, YI's initiative, that is the YI Nets, aims to create a dialogue with school and college students to engage them in self-development, community development, and nation building. What we really want them to be or become is change agents. As usual, this year was filled with activities. Can anyone give us a wild guess as to how many activities were done under the Youth Affairs banner this year? Just a wild guess. We have a recorded number of 370 activities, which is excluding the National Volunteering Week, which by itself and it's always a pleasure to work with the students. But before I get into the awards, I should thank each and every one of you for the active role you played during the National Volunteering Week. Because that 1 week, I think we touched 16 million lives. I think all of you deserve an applause for yourself. With that small introduction, may I request you, sir, to kindly give away the awards for this year. The best net project is the Mission Blackboard project by Acropolis Indore. I would like to call upon Siddharth Barodaya and Deepak Kukreja from Acropolis Institute What's happened? The best net activity or the best net event was the anti-corruption rally done by Nanamini Education Institute, Erode. I'm sure you can give them a better round of applause. Come on. XLRI Jamshedpur deserves a special recognition for the maximum number of events that was conducted this year. I call upon Prerna, Kumar and Swati to kindly come forward and collect the award. Do we have Prerna and Swati here? Okay. Next, we have the awards for the best nets. The third prize goes to Bhavans Rajaji Vidyashram, Chennai. Do we have someone from the net here? Could we have someone from the chapter come forward and collect the award, please? From Chennai. Prasanna, please. They've been an active net since 2006 and the only net to have received an award every year. The second prize goes to the Millennium School, Chandigarh. Could we have Robin and Amit Chuk kindly come forward and collect the award, please? Millennium has been one of our most consistent nets, and over the last 4 years, with about 243 student members, been doing activities. This year, they did activities like the Joy of Giving Month, e-waste collection drive, and of course, participated in the National Volunteering Week. They were also the winners of the National Green Eye Contest in 2013. The Best Net Award goes to Kongu Engineering College, Erode. Kongu has been associated with us for the last 2 years and with about 700 student members. I should also give a special mention of the net report that they sent to me. This is the Kongu this year's activity report. So, it is signed by their principal and every office bearer from the chapter. So, made my job a lot easier. Of course, for the nets to do well, you need a good faculty coordinator. For the best faculty coordinator, I request Bhavana Banerjee from VNS Group of Institutions, Bhopal, to kindly come forward. She's a faculty coordinator and a YI member too. Come on, you can do better than this with your applause. It takes a dedicated person to drive the youth affairs activities in the chapter. And this year, Jagannath Das from Calcutta has been the person who's been driving it the maximum. I request Jagannath to kindly come forward. Congratulations to all the winners, and thank you everyone for your support this year.
Good evening. Before we move on to the next session, this is going to be a very quick 5-minute detour from the agenda. There's one gentleman sitting in this audience very quietly from morning who's very inconspicuous but an amazing personality. He's been a great friend of II, and he's somebody whom we would like to recognize. We would like to probably give our due respects to him, but we would like to do it in a proper manner. I request Shankar to come forward and do the rightful honors, and Mr. Amin, please join us on the stage.
Good evening. This gentleman who's here, when Srikanth told me that I should say a few words about him, for a moment the PC was working a little slow. I was trying to remember when I met him first and how it all started. Many years ago, when Bhairavi was the chairman, national chairman, and we started communication with the Commonwealth as an organization, we started understanding. There was an invitation to go to Colombo. Then myself and Rahul went to London for a round table. That started a conversation. In that conversation in London and post, we were discussing many things. From there till now, YI as an organization in India, a young organization with young Indians, but Commonwealth with 48 countries with a presence all around the world. India was part of the Commonwealth, and we got to know a lot more, understood that the Commonwealth Youth Program, which was housed in India, in Chandigarh, we started networking with them, and then came out CHI. CHI was born, and this is one of the first initiatives in YI where we worked with an international organization, a global organization, and a new organization was founded, truly a feather in YI's cap. But what's also important is this would not have been possible without Commonwealth as a global organization, Commonwealth Asia, and Mr. Amin and his office and his team, a fantastic partnership which has, you all know how it has mushroomed and it has grown, and I think it has a greater future. I think on behalf of YI, all of us, me personally, Srikanth and Guru, we want to thank you. And this thank you is only to say that a lot more needs to be done. Wherever you are, I think this work will continue, and we will want to partner with you and take this forward. But ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all of you, on behalf of Young Indians, let us thank him, thank Commonwealth Asia, thank Commonwealth Youth Program and Commonwealth Global for this partnership, and let's take this on forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Amin.
Young Indian friends, Shankar, Srikanth, Guru, and all others. I might be knowing, I think, many of you. I'm a supporter of Young Indians. You can say I'm a promoter of Young Indians because they deserve to be promoted. And the first time I spoke to Bhairavi, she was very busy, I think, in 2011. Then I met Rahul Mirchandani. And finally, I officially met Shankar in Delhi, and we discussed that how could we move ahead. And the Commonwealth Asia Alliance of Young Entrepreneurs is conceived, and it is born in the hands of young Indians, the great team, and being nurtured and moved forward by the young Indians. And I'm very happy to share at this moment that this alliance has been recognized as a best practice model. Commonwealth Secretariat wishes to replicate this model in other regions of the Commonwealth. And while interacting and attending the Young Indians meetings, or for that matter G20 along with them, I prefer to be a listener because I want to be educated, I want to be motivated, I want to be supported by the young Indians, and it's a great honor and opportunity, and I must thank all of you who are here, and I'm sure that you have been in the process of changing India, changing the world, changing the perception of the young people, and I wish you all the best, and the Commonwealth would always be with young Indians. Thank you so much.
A big round of cheer for the next speaker, Kumar Bagrodia. Come on! Sorry. A big round of cheer for the next speaker, Mr. Sudhir Mishra. He doesn't need an introduction, but thank you for the applaud in any case, when I said my name. So, Sudhir, please welcome on stage. I'm not going to read. Whatever you'd like.
Can I keep sitting here and not go there? I'm not very comfortable here.
Absolutely.
And especially after Mr. Kiran Karnik's lecture, you wonder what you're going to say anyway.
No, please go ahead. So, we need to read out this illustrious bio. Everyone knows Sudhir, but we should do this deed. He's a MPhil from Delhi University, where he met Badal Sarkar, and with whom he formed his first workshop theatre, which was a theatre group, and he worked on several plays with him. Sometime with Badal, and then he moved to Pune, where he spent time at the Film and Television Institute of India with his younger brother Sudhanshu Mishra, who was a student there. Incidentally, Sudhir never studied at FTII, he used to just hang around out there. And we'll figure out...
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
I never studied there. I went there via my brother.
Via your brother?
I didn't pay the fees,
And in 1980, he moved to Mumbai and started his career as assistant director and screenwriter in the cult classic, I would say, Jaane Bhi Do Yaron, which we all know about. And he's worked on a slew of films which have won critical acclaim, like Mohan Joshi, Hazir Ho, and Khamoshi. He got his first National Film Award for Ye Wo Manzil To Nahi in 1987. He's made several movies after that, Main Zinda Hoon, Is Raat Ki Subah Nahi, Chameli, Khoya Khoya Chand, Hazaro Khwahishein Aisi, Ye Sali Zindagi, and most recently, Inkar. So big round of applause.